evening, and if you could please take your seats and we will start the lecture. Thank you so much indeed. So good evening everyone and welcome to the University of Glasgow. I am Professor Sarah Carter. I'm one of the Vice Principals of the University and Head of the College of Social Sciences. And it's my honour and privilege to be here this evening to introduce our 25th annual Holocaust Memorial Lecture. Now, the University of Glasgow's annual Holocaust Memorial Lecture was established by Professor Bernard Wasserstein, Emeritus Professor Otto Hutter, and Professor Ray Stokes, with the first lecture taking place in 2001. And as we mark the 25th year of this series, we recognize the invaluable contributions of these individuals who managed the series from its inception until only a few years ago. Now, since that inaugural lecture, this event has become an important fixture in the University of Glasgow's calendar, and a major contribution, we hope, to the global academic conversation, attracting some of the most respected experts in Holocaust studies from around the world. But the success of this lecture is not ours alone, and we are deeply grateful to our friends, colleagues, and partners who have supported us over many years, many of whom have been with us since the beginning. And with that in mind, I would like to welcome our long-standing friends from the Association of Jewish Refugees, who are here with us in the audience, and we are profoundly thankful for their continued partnership. May I also take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Henry Lovett and Mia Spiro, for their help in producing tonight's lecture. And last, but definitely not least, I'm grateful to all of you for joining us here this evening and continuing to make this lecture series such a success. And that includes not only all of the audience here tonight in the lecture theatre, but all of the many people who are joining us online as part of the event. Now, this lecture series is a testament to the value the university places on Holocaust education and remembrance. We remain committed to ensuring its ongoing success and relevance in the years to come. This is an occasion of profound significance, where we come together to commemorate the lives lost and the resilience shown during one of the darkest periods in human history. The relevance of this event to the present day is crystal clear. It serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of hatred and the importance of standing against prejudice in all its forms. The echoes of history that emanate from the Holocaust should always prompt us to prioritize learning and understanding of what happened to ensure that we continually steer humanity away from this darkness and towards the light. And it's in this spirit of remembrance and education that we are privileged to have with us a distinguished expert who has dedicated her career to uncovering and preserving the truths of this dark chapter of history. It is my great honor to introduce our special guest speaker, Professor Caroline Sturdy Colls, Professor of Holocaust Archaeology and Genocide Investigation, and the Director of the Center of Archaeology at the University of Huddersfield. Professor Sturdy Colls has supervised projects at over 60 Holocaust sites and is currently leading the Treblinka Nexus of the Final Solution project. She collaborates on mass grave investigations in Ukraine and with the Lake District Holocaust Project. Her notable publications include Holocaust Archaeologies, The Handbook of Missing Persons, and Adolf Island, the Nazi occupation of Alderney. Recognized with the European Archaeological Heritage Prize, she has also been a visiting fellow at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and delivered the prestigious Meyerhoff Annual Lecture. Her pioneering work includes the first archaeological investigations at Treblinka extermination and labor camps, and her recent monograph, Finding Treblinka, Forensic and Archaeological Perspectives, provides new insights into the crimes that were committed there. Tonight, Professor Sturdy Colls will present her lecture titled All That Remains, Objects from Treblinka Extermination Camp. She will discuss the objects found during the forensic archaeological investigations at Treblinka and how these discoveries have revealed new insights into the camp's history and the experiences of those who were there. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome such an esteemed speaker to the stage tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Caroline Sturdy Colls.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. And I'm absolutely delighted to see so many people here this evening. It reflects your commitment as well to acknowledging the crimes of the Holocaust and to mark Holocaust Memorial Day 2025. And I'm also extremely grateful to the University of Glasgow for this very kind invitation and for hosting me over the next couple of days. So to begin, on the 19th of July 1942, Heinrich Himmler ordered the resettlement of the entire Jewish population of the general government by the 31st of December that year. This was certainly not the first time that the notion of resettlement in the East, as the Nazis called it, had been suggested, nor was it the first time that this term had been used in an attempt to convince Jews that they were being sent to labor camps in Eastern Europe. As Timothy Schneider accurately asserts in his book Bloodlands, by the end of 1941, resettlement to the east would mean mass murder. To facilitate what the Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish question, 3 camps were constructed as part of an operation known as Action Reinhard. Belzec, which received its first transport on the 17th of March 1942, Sobibor, where 167,000 Jews were exterminated between April 1942 and mid-October 1943, and the largest of the 3 camps, Treblinka, which received its first regular train transportation on the 23rd of July 1942, and where between 800,000 and 1 million Jews were killed. An unknown number of non-Jewish Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and Roma were also murdered in these 3 extermination centres. Developed at Belzec and Sobibor and supposedly perfected at Treblinka, the killing processes involved in the annihilation of the Jewish population centred around the mass transportation of Jews to remote, well-connected locations, usually by train, when the majority would be killed within hours of arrival. At Treblinka, many people were killed within 15 to 20 minutes when the camp was operating most efficiently. Victims were first separated, disorientated, forced from the trains. Women and children were sent to the left, men to the right. And after being made to hand over their personal belongings, most were pushed along the so-called Himmelstrasse, the road to heaven, which led to the gas chambers. And we can see these areas on the plan behind me. So Treblinka had 3 main zones: the reception camp area here, the death camp, oh, sorry about the laser pen. There we go, the death camp area to the rear of the camp, and on the left of the screen there, the SS administration and living quarters. After they'd been killed in the gas chambers, the victims were either buried in mass graves, or from the winter of 1942 and into 1943, their bodies were cremated on makeshift cremation pyres. There were actually, however, some exceptions. The elderly, sick, or people who resisted in the so-called reception camp were sent to a building known as the Lazaret, a fake field hospital behind which they were shot into an ever-burning pit. Others were shot or beaten elsewhere in the camp landscape. My research has actually shown that although gassing remained the predominant killing method, shootings actually took place at Treblinka from the moment at which the camp was being constructed until it was demolished and closed in the autumn of 1943. At first, this was because the gas chambers were not yet ready, then because they were not large enough to cope with the large number of transports, and also, many examples demonstrate, because the SS and Treblinka men appear to have treated the execution and shooting of Jews as a sport that they continue to enjoy. As the historian Yitzhak Arad has argued, the smooth execution of the deportation of Jews from the ghettos depended on the passive behaviour of Jews. Hence, the Nazis had to implement a sophisticated ruse to ensure the success of their killing operations. Here, architecture, the landscape, and material culture all played important roles. Co-location of Treblinka II, the extermination camp, with Treblinka I, a labour camp which had existed at the site since 1941, the camp's strategic location on a major railway line, and the camouflage afforded by the surrounding forest were all part of the attempts to erase the existence of the camp and ensure it would go unnoticed. Gas chambers were designed to look like bathhouses. The fake field hospital I already mentioned. Later, a fake train station, for example, was built on the platform, and mass graves were hidden behind sandbanks to continue to present a facade that this was just a transit camp, where new arrivals would receive medical attention or have a much-needed wash. However, the ruse of being resettled in the East began long before the Jews arrived at Treblinka, and objects were central to cementing this narrative. As Robert Ehrenreich and I have argued in an article we wrote entitled Value in Context, Material Culture in Treblinka, since Treblinka II was a death camp and did not include a major slave labour component, the main economic benefit derived from its operation was the expropriation of Jewish possessions for eventual sale to the German population or use in the war effort. Or to put it more simply, in the words of survivor Yankel Wernick, everything the Jews left behind had its value and its place, but the Jews themselves had none. Hence, to facilitate this mammoth operation of armed robbery, maximise the financial gains that could be made, and ensure Jews complied during transports, deportees were actively encouraged to bring with them belongings that they would need when they began their fictitious new life in the East. Particularly items of value, which it was implied would be stolen or taken from them or lost if left behind. Hence, deportees, as we see in many of the deportation photographs from the Warsaw Ghetto and other locations across Europe, carried large amounts of money and gold, jewellery, official documents, domestic items, photographs, letters, notebooks and foodstuffs in their suitcases and on their bodies in an attempt to protect and conceal them from those who would seek to take them. A cruel reality that actually allowed the Germans to take them more easily. Upon arrival at Treblinka, as I mentioned, deportees were asked to strip naked, and the men had to fold their pile of clothing neatly. Next, they handed over these belongings, supposedly for safekeeping. Property tags were issued in a purpose-built barrack, and owners were assured that their items would be returned after they had taken a shower. During the second phase of the camp's operations, a sign even announced there are no limits on foreign exchange, and each victim was told to keep 1 Polish złoty, which was used to pay for a bath. These so-called fees were collected by a Treblinka men, one of the auxiliary guards who assisted the SS with the killing operations, and this guard sat in a wooden box whose window faced the pathway leading to the gas chambers. Of course, none of these items were actually returned. Instead, they were sorted by Jews who were divided into Sonderkommando by object type, while less specialised labourers sorted clothing and shoes, watchmakers and jewellers appraised articles of precious metal. Such was the scale of these operations that Samuel Reisman spent 3 months sorting nothing but spectacles, whilst Alexander Krudlik worked for 6 months with fountain pens. And studies have shown that more than 1,200 railroad cars full of objects were sent from Treblinka 2 to places such as Lublin and Białystok, where items were sorted and repaired before being shipped to Germany. And additionally, witnesses also report that between December 1942 and March 1943, and possibly at other times, gold and money was put into suitcases and transported by vehicle after the creation of a special Goldjuden working group of Jews to sort and locate valuables, including from the bodies of the living and deceased. Hence, if we look at documentary and oral testimonies to do with Treblinka, it appears that there was a seemingly well-organised system that emerged that resulted not only in the mass extermination of individuals, but also in the movement of much of the material culture associated with the victims of the camp away from the site. However, as we'll see shortly, this was not the case for all objects, and many of them, in fact, remained beneath the ground. And in my forthcoming book, Finding Treblinka, I explore in considerable depth the various interactions that the guards, working Jews, victims, local people, and looters after the war had with these objects. I also explore the various assemblages of objects pertaining to the camp that can be found, albeit in small numbers, around the world, in museum archives, personal collections, forensic repositories, and exhibitions. But given the limit of time this evening, I'd like to focus for the rest of my presentation on the items that my team and I recovered during our forensic archaeological investigations at Treblinka, including in which are some of the items that the soon-to-be victims brought with them to the extermination camp. Additionally, these items included items connected to the guards, who oversaw and participated in their murders, to the Sonderkommando, who were forced to sort the belongings and assist with the killing process, and objects relating to the killing apparatus in the death camp area. Before embarking on this discussion, for context, I should point out that I undertook archaeological investigations at Treblinka between 2010 and 2019, and I've continued to undertake detailed archival research and post-processing of our data even up until last year. And the methodology that I used at Treblinka was an interdisciplinary one, and one that was largely non-invasive. And this methodology began with desk-based research, historical inquiry, that began with the analysis of documents, maps, plans, aerial photographs, ground-based photography, and satellite data, enabling me to determine the history of the camp. Drawing upon a wide range of survey methods, such as total station survey, global positioning systems, GPS, and a technique called LiDAR that I'll say more about shortly, I was able to record the surface remains that exist at the site, such as the traces of structures, surface objects, and I was able to create a detailed digital terrain model that indicated the presence of remains beneath the ground. I also used a suite of techniques called geophysical survey methods. These included resistance survey, electrical imaging, and ground-penetrating radar. We don't have time this evening to go into the specifics of how these techniques work. However, I should say that they don't function like X-ray machines, but rather they search for what archaeologists call anomalies beneath the ground. So it's possible to use them, for example, to locate buried building foundations, the traces of mass graves, and other infrastructural elements of the camp. So to give you some examples of our results, this included, using entirely non-invasive methods, the remains of the old and new gas chambers, which we were able to locate, traces of the aforementioned lazaret. We found traces of the camp boundaries and many of the administration camp structures where the guards were living, and we located many unmarked mass graves and cremation sites. And then, having undertaken this non-invasive work, we were granted permission to do some small-scale excavations, in the area that we believed the old and new gas chambers were located, and also in the administration camp. And these excavations, it was very important, needed to be only undertaken away from the areas containing mass graves. And this is because Jewish law, or halakha, stipulates, generally speaking, that human remains buried in a grave shouldn't be disturbed. And as part of my doctoral research, and then later my book, Holocaust Archaeologies, the methodology that I developed really centered on devising an archaeological methodology that adhered to the principles of Jewish law and to the other ethical considerations involved in the study of such a sensitive site. And it's important to point out that at the time this work began, not only did Treblinka serve a function as a memorial site with very few physical traces in the landscape, but very few objects actually existed from the camp in the museum at Treblinka or anywhere else in the world. No on-site investigations of a forensic nature had been undertaken since the 1940s. And there were some small-scale excavations as well, although not archaeological ones, when the memorial was built there in the 1960s. But my research has generally shown that the value of the physical evidence at the camp was overlooked. Similarly, as part of their efforts to hide the crimes, I should point out that the Nazis and their collaborators attempted to destroy all traces of the sites that they'd constructed to wipe out the European Jewry and of the remains of those they had murdered. And I think at Treblinka this was particularly extensive. It resulted in the demolition of many of the camp buildings, the levelling of the landscape and the burning of the bodies of those killed. The area was turned into farmland, and one of the aforementioned Treblinka men were installed in a farmhouse to give the impression that this site had been nothing but a farm. And all of this happened in the autumn of 1943, so long before this area was subsequently liberated by the Red Army and long before the eyes of the world could set their sights on the camp. And therefore, this led to the perception at the time and afterwards that the Nazis had somehow been successful in erasing all of this evidence. And post-war looting efforts that also occurred resulted in the further removal of items from the terrain, but also cast further doubt on the idea that there was any physical evidence left to find. However, our forensic archaeological discoveries at the camp have shown that an abundance of physical evidence does in fact exist, including the objects that I will speak about now, which were not in fact shipped to Germany or elsewhere for reuse. In fact, we found more than 2,000 artifacts, much of which counts as more of the kind of building material, but also a number of what we as archaeologists call special finds, which I'll speak about shortly. And our trenches, I should say, were very small. Some of them were only 1 metre by 1 metre. The biggest, I think, was about 2 metres by 1 metre. So we're not talking about huge excavations here, but we actually did find an abundance of objects. And many of those now feature in the permanent exhibition at the Treblinka Museum. And as the majority of the objects that we did find came from the area surrounding the old gas chambers, the first gas chambers at Treblinka, and the waste pit area, I'll discuss those assemblage this evening. So just to give you a little bit of background, I have spoken extensively about the investigations of the structures at Treblinka in other lectures, and we are, of course, limited by time, but I think it's important to point out that in 2010, when I undertook the first non-invasive works at Treblinka, we were able at that time, using the method of ground-penetrating radar, to identify what we believe to be the foundations of the first gas chambers that were built at Treblinka when it opened in July 1942. We were at first confronted with an abundance of historical evidence that suggested that the gas chambers were probably located where you can see it says Memorial Obelisk on this LiDAR data set. And Claude Lanzmann, in his famous film Shoah, actually intimated that the gas chambers were in this location. However, when we looked at maps and plans and reviewed them, we felt that the gas chambers must in fact be located much further into the death camp area. And I should say that the gas chambers were the only buildings in Treblinka that were built from brick in the death camp area. There were no permanent living accommodation buildings for Jews because, as I mentioned, they were killed immediately upon arrival. So this structure appeared to be about 22 metres by 15 metres, and when we did a LiDAR survey in 2013, you can probably just about see on the slide here that there's an area that is actually a shallow depression that shows up in this data set, indicating that there may well be something buried beneath the ground as well. And so when we carried out these excavations in 2013 and 2017, we were able to locate the foundations of what we believed to be the old gas chamber building. We were also able to identify the fact that the end of the building where the motor that pumped carbon dioxide into the gas chamber had been much more extensively destroyed than the rest of the structure. So we were able to say something about this post-war demolition process as well. And we found many objects in these excavations, many more certainly than I was even expecting to. For example, we found tiles, bricks, nails, a plank of wood, many pieces of plaster and barbed wire, which we believe to be associated with this area where the gas chambers were located and the structure itself. Perhaps most prominent were the tiles that we uncovered. We have many examples of these. There are just two on the slide here, in the red and the yellow tiles that you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. And these were tiles that were manufactured by a Polish company called Jabulski and Langer. And the descriptions of them in testimonies talk about clay tiles, terracotta tiles lining the walls of the gas chambers to give them the appearance of a bathhouse. And so these tiles appear to confirm those witness descriptions. We also found a number of what archaeologists would call special finds located within two trenches, excavated within the gas chamber structure, and one immediately adjacent to it. And these items almost certainly belonged to the people who were killed in the gas chambers. And so these items show us that the strict rules and standardized killing procedure that I explained earlier wasn't always followed, for reasons I'll go into shortly. So, for example, you can see here on the slide many examples of women's jewellery. And these materials were found directly above and in the surroundings of the old gas chambers. These items included the rose-shaped brooch made of brass that you can see in the centre, a gold pendant minus its chain and stone or other jewellery filament, 3 beads and 3 gold jewellery fragments. Now, unfortunately, none of these items bore marks that illustrated who they might have belonged to, but their discovery in this area, as opposed to the reception camp where they were meant to have been handed over to the Germans, suggests that they were probably smuggled into the death camp area by their owners due to the sentimental or financial value. And although the reception camp and the death camp are in close proximity, the only way in and out was along the road to heaven that I already mentioned, and these two areas were completely separated by huge sandbanks. So it wouldn't be very easy for material to move through the area unless it was being carried by someone. Therefore, I believe that these items attest to both the small acts of resistance that took place in the moments before Jewish victims were murdered, and to the fact that not all items of financial value were actually found by the Nazis at the time or thereafter. And these ideas are further supported by the fact that 12 items of jewellery and several watches were also found by archaeologists from the University of Treblinka in the death camp area when they carried out excavations at Treblinka in 2019 as part of pre-assessment research for the new museum that's being built at the site currently. All of these items, I should say as well, escaped the notice of the looters who plundered the sites for decades after the war, possibly because they were in areas where it was suggested, areas where it wasn't thought that personal effects could be found. We can't, of course, know for certain whether the women who kept these items believed that they would live or die, whether they were holding on to these objects because they genuinely believed that they were about to embark on a life in the East, or because they knew that they were going to be murdered and wanted to hold on to the items that they held dear. However, as a good friend and colleague Layla Renshaw has argued, the fact that the person was in possession of these mundane items at the moment of death emphasizes the dramatic assertion of the extraordinary horror and violence into the ordinary fabric of existence. The poignancy of these objects lies in the fact that they have outlived their owners and in their anonymity, which reflects the extensive nature of the Nazi extermination processes. As Robert Ehrenreich and I have also argued, these items provide an opportunity to reflect on who the victims might have been, who they could have attained, what they could have attained had they not been murdered, and what they may have experienced. The anonymity of the objects also demonstrates how the perpetrators progressively stripped people of their possessions, their identity, and finally their lives during the extermination process. And many of these items also demonstrate, along with others, expressions of femininity that remained important even under the most desperate of circumstances. And for the Treblinka Museum, the rose-shaped brooch has actually become an international symbol of suffering perpetrated at Treblinka and the women murdered there, and has featured in a book entitled 100 Objects of the Holocaust. Another group of objects that attest to the experiences of women are 14 hair clips and slides that were also discovered in these 3 trenches dug above and adjacent to the old gas chambers. Along with these and any other personal belongings, they too should have been handed over in the reception camp. Or alternatively, they should have been taken from the women when they had their hair cut in the reception camp area. But returning to testimonies again helps us understand why they may have found their way into the death camp. During the 3rd phase of the camp's operations, at least one of the rooms in the old gas chambers was reportedly used as a hair-cutting area. Some testimonies imply this occurred when the number of incoming transports was so high that the reception camp became too overcrowded. Others imply that it was a regular part of the killing process. And we have testimonies of several so-called Treblinka barbers, work Jews who were kept alive to cut the hair of the women who arrived in the camp. One of these, Chill Reichman, described how in October 1942, I had my scissors and they marched us to the gas chambers area. On opening the door, they rushed the victims with yelling and screaming. They had to go through that open gas chamber. They forced them to sit down and we cut their hair with 5 cuts. On one occasion, he recalled how a woman sits before me. She tears out her hairpins and shouts at me, "Faster, do what you want. You can even cut some of the flesh out of my scalp. I know that I am lost." The commodification of women's hair was subsequently facilitated by this process. And as a final point, I should also add that we did find parts of scissors alongside the hair clips in this area as well. We also found other traces, for example, of clothing. 3 small buttons were found amongst the rubble of the old gas chambers. And it's important to say here that, as Richard Birnbeck and Susan Pollock, other well-known Holocaust archaeologists, have warned, we must, of course, be very wary about over-interpreting the significance of single objects. But these items do give us pause to consider whether they fell from the clothing of the Sonderkommando, which seems fairly unlikely as 2 of the buttons were quite ornate, or whether some of the victims remained clothed upon arrival to the gas chambers, a detail again which is supported by some testimonies. Similarly, a belt buckle, leather fragments, a gold-plated fragment from a pair of glasses, and small denomination coins present similar questions. So whilst we do have some answers, of course, from these excavations, because of the nature of the killing at Treblinka, we are, of course, also left with many questions. Several items found at the site of the old gas chambers are perhaps more likely to be connected to the perpetrators. There's not an image of it here, but we did find 120 fragments of broken bottle glass in the 3 trenches that we excavated. And certainly we know from testimonies and scholarly research, particularly that undertaken by Edward Westerman, that alcohol played a role in the violence carried out by SS guards and Travniki men at Treblinka too, and in other camps such as Belzec, where large quantities of beer bottle tops were also found during archaeological works. The quantity of bottle glass found in this area perhaps suggests that the guards were drinking whilst carrying out the gassings. And again, we have testimony. that supports them being drunk whilst undertaking this process. Other items included a metal drill bit, a spanner, batteries, a padlock, and a small flip knife. We don't know again, but they could have possibly belonged to guards or members of the Sonderkommando. So overall, we've found many important details about the killing process and divergences from it by these small excavations in the old gas chamber area. And continuing the discussion about the importance of where objects are found, I'd like to now turn my attention to an area that existed east of the living camp. And this is the camp's so-called waste pit. When I compared sketches drawn by witnesses, aerial photographs, and again, LiDAR data, this suggested that there could have been a waste pit in the northern part of the living camp area, the northeastern corner. This area at the time when I first visited was a forested expanse. There was vegetation everywhere. It made it very difficult to see where you were walking, and there were very well-established trees. But archaeologists often look for very subtle traces in the landscape, such as depressions that we can see, or perhaps we can feel them as we're walking across the landscape. We also look for vegetation differences, different plants growing in different areas. And so when I first embarked on a walkover survey in this area in 2010, I already began to come across objects lying on the surface and a depression where I believe the waste pit might be located. So then in 2013, when I returned to Treblinka, I had a team of 5 people systematically walk through the area in even space transects, and I tried to identify objects that existed on the surface. And we actually found 200 items in a very small space, 78 of which we could designate special finds because they were neither building material or identifiably modern. So thinking back to what I said at the beginning about the idea that the evidence at Treblinka had been erased, we were literally walking the landscape and finding it beneath our feet. So before I discuss the nature of those items, I think it's important to highlight 3 things. The first is that their discoveries highlighted that this was certainly an area that had been used for what we could call leisure activities in recent times, which sounds very disturbing and quite incredible in an area that's supposed to be a designated memorial site. But we know that people go there to have picnics. We know that people went there to drink alcohol. We certainly came across a number of beer bottles, cans, camping equipment and things in the forest. Secondly, the items connected to the camp still existed in the landscape, as I mentioned, and were very visible. And thirdly, looting in the area obviously still continues. It was very clear that some of these objects had been recently dug up, and that's why we found them on the surface. And so this situation leads to several issues establishing what we call the provenance of objects, the time period to which they relate, because the objects had been removed from their original context when they were dug out of the ground. So in the absence of the provenance information, the materiality of the objects was what we needed to evaluate for dating them, to establish whether they actually did relate to Treblinka II, or whether they belonged to a time period thereafter or even before, and if possible to determine to whom these objects might belong. So most of the objects we found during the walkover survey were connected to food and drink production and consumption. We actually found 70 items which fell under the categories of pans, pots, glasses, bottles, bottle tops, ceramics and cutlery. Notable objects include an enamel cup manufactured by the Slovenian firm Adolf Weston that you can see in the top left of the slide here. There was also a porcelain bottle top for a mineral water company based in Lublin in Poland, which is the second image down on the left. And there was a pepper shaker and numerous examples of Polish enamelware manufactured by Polish firms Bosławek, Ideal, and S, possibly standing for Silesia, which is the region that Treblinka is located in. And many of these enamelware items did bear logos, and they were being produced, we discovered, in the interwar years, so 1919 to 1938. And many of the firms that made them then turned their attention to producing items connected to the German war effort during World War II. Some of these companies ceased production in 1945 or were nationalised in 1948, resulting in logo changes. So it made it possible to determine that at least some of the enamelware pertained to the camp's period of operation. But unfortunately, because some companies continued production long after the war, and actually these items became kind of vintage, popular enamelware in Poland, it became extremely difficult, because they were surface finds, to determine whether they related to the camp's period or not. As I say, not in all cases, but certainly in some. And so to illustrate these issues, I worked with an artist called Michael Safarich-Branthwaite, and we wrote an article in 2018 called "This is Proof: Forensic Evidence and Ambiguous Material Culture at Treblinka Extermination Camp." And we also created several exhibitions at the Treblinka Museum, at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, and the Stockport War Memorial and Gallery. And this item was so interesting to us because it actually attracted the attention of survivor Samuel Willenberg during our fieldwork when we were processing the item, and he was visiting the camp to make a television programme. Samuel came over, and I'll never forget, and he said, "This is proof. This is proof that the victims of Treblinka did not know the fate that awaited them, that they believed that they were going to be resettled in the East." And Samuel spent months sorting the belongings of the victims in the reception camp area as a member of the Sonderkommando, and he said he'd seen many similar items like this. So to him, the very fact that this pan was even in Treblinka meant that its owner, who must have been under the illusion they would live to be resettled, must have died in the camp. Now, Samuel may well have been correct, but to archaeologists, of course, like myself, this pan highlighted some of the challenges in interpreting what we call unstratified objects, objects found on the surface, particularly those which had been subject to looting, which was undoubtedly the case here. And so given the lack of context, it was possible to say that the pan might have belonged to the time period when the camp was operating. It could have belonged to someone who came to Treblinka, but it could have belonged to a camp guard, to a member of the Sonderkommando. It could have belonged to any number of people who visited the camp in the post-war period, or somebody who visited the site even more recently and used the site as somewhere to sit and eat and drink with friends. Given the similarities between items such as this and other items found at the extermination camp, and other sites such as Katyn and Auschwitz-Birkenau, it's still highly likely that the pan did have a connection to the extermination camp, but the excavation of it from the ground without archaeological expertise has, of course, removed the possibility to determine this. So I think for us, this item really highlights the need for both archaeological interventions and the protection of sites like Treblinka to prevent illegal digging in the future. Beyond these domestic items, we also found other varied surface finds. We found 2 bases of Nivea tins, one of which was manufactured in Germany sometime between 1935 and 1949. The second was also likely made in Germany, but it was very difficult for us to see here because it was, again, because it was on the surface, it had eroded. We found parts of an engine, a metal grate, small buckets, and a series of non-jewellery but metal rings. But again, we couldn't date these items because they were found on the surface. That said, we did have a somewhat remarkable discovery, but it actually took many years to realise how remarkable this actually was. And this is, to date, this is the only item that I think I can fairly say could be conclusively dated to the camp period because of the, the inherent materiality of it. And this item was the only item that had Nazi insignia on it as well that we found. And it was a heavily corroded, curved piece of metal. And when we undertook high-definition photography and laser scanning, we saw that it contained the words Lager Polizei, which means camp police. And for many years, I actually assumed that this was some sort of sign, perhaps used as a breastplate for a horse, or maybe a sign in the camp that indicated the function of a room or a building. But several years later, when we were doing archival research with materials from Ukraine and the Russian archives, we actually came across a testimony of a Travniki man called Nikolai Skakadub. And my research assistant, Dario Chakaska, translated his testimony, which gave us a really remarkable alternative interpretation. Skakadub actually recalled a camp policeman and courier called Vasilenko, who wore a big metal pendant which was semi-oval in shape. It was large and made from flat tin plate, painted white, and which bore the inscription Lager Polizei in yellow text. The uniqueness of this object and the similarities between this description and the discovered item means that this represents an extremely rare case in archaeological studies of the Holocaust, where a specific object may well have been described by a witness and may well have been discovered. We also discovered many items that might have belonged to the camp guards through this walkover survey, and again they present the same issues of dating, but some are certainly military issue. We have a metal water bottle, a metal mess tin, for example. But again, we know that the Red Army occupied this area, the Polish military, from 1944 onwards. But we can date some other items. We have beer bottle tops by a brewery that was only open until 1948. And we have many of these. And so to return to my earlier point about the role of alcohol, we know that in the SS living area, the SS frequently hosted banquets where alcohol consumption was prevalent, including when Heinrich Himmler himself visited Treblinka too. And so it is entirely possible that these items could have been used by the camp guards. In 2017, we actually decided to partially excavate the waste pit area. And this was a collaboration that we undertook with Pavel Varetska and his students from the University of West Bohemia. And these excavations, because we found items in situ, allowed us to really give a much more detailed analysis and date the objects that we found. And so this excavation was really motivated by three things. The finds we already found, which I already described. The fact that waste disposal sites have certainly yielded invaluable insights at other Nazi camps. And I think, as any archaeologists know, if we come to understand our discards, then we will better understand the world in which we live, to paraphrase a conflict archaeology colleague of mine. A metal detector survey was first carried out over the area, but over an area of 20 metres by 10 metres, and we found an abundance of artefacts again on the surface: a 9mm bullet cartridge, a coin, a shovel head, a tin pot, as well as some other modern items. And then we dug an evaluation trench. Again, we couldn't excavate the entire pit, but we did a strip measuring 8 metres by 1 metre. And this was sited based again on the non-invasive research and the vegetation clearance revealing this depression that I showed you in an earlier slide. And when we uncovered when we removed the vegetation and we started to excavate systematically through the layers, it became very apparent that there was a large pit that existed in the area. Into at least one smaller pit had been dug. And there had been several depositional events that had created a series of layers to this pit of objects. And in the upmost layer of this, we found frequent pebbles, occasional brick and concrete fragments, but we found 31 objects, again, most of which consisted of ceramics, spoons, knives, buttons, and coins. Some of the notable items you can see on the bottom here, sort of the second from the right, was a piece of either a clarinet or a cornet, a possible piece of a candle holder, and there was also a ceramic item like this one that you can see with a deer logo, which is the one on the sort of third from the left, third from the right on the screen here, which again is Polish, interwar period Polish pottery manufacturer. In the smaller pit, we found 60 objects. Again, some examples shown here: many spoons, knives, glass, ceramics, and enamelware. And we had 12 relatively well-preserved pots and pans, including one that still had its mismatched lid on it in situ that you can see there, a large pan in the middle. We had several large bowls, again manufactured by Polish companies that we could identify. But we had ceramics from elsewhere in the world. So, for example, a ceramic with the Czech maker's mark Bajuro, a piece of glass with Cyrillic letters, and many broken bottles again. We had many metal objects like milk urns, milk cans, keys, bucket handles, and we also had a suitcase handle that possibly came from a small child's suitcase. And a comb and a fragment of toothbrush were found. We found a lid as well from a writing box that we could identify as being the German stationery manufacturer Pelican. And all of these objects were once again mixed with rubble, brick, plaster, stones and mortar, suggesting that these may have been the demolition layers when the camp was destroyed and various objects were just simply piled into the waste pit area as the Nazis retreated from the area. But the most substantial layer of the pit, which I should say extended well beneath 2.25 metres, which was that was as deep as we could possibly excavate safely, because Treblinka is sand, and so obviously excavating in sand means that it's going to collapse in on itself quite frequently. So we know this waste pit was much deeper than 2.25 metres, but we found 1,329 individual items in this small trench, along with fragments of burnt and unburnt human remains, which with the support of the Chief Rabbi of Poland, we were able to rebury. Around 80% of the material, once again, consisted of broken glass. And again, the testimonies are interesting here because there was actually a special bottle sorting detail at Treblinka. It's really remarkable the lengths that the Nazis went to extract the value from the objects that they took from Jews who arrived. So they actually had a system in place where working Jews would take bottles from the arriving transports. And we know from witnesses that if a Jewish worker broke a bottle, that they would be immediately shot. That's how precious they were seen to be. And actually, that the work Jews used the prams left behind by the mothers who'd been murdered at Treblinka to transport bottles safely for sending back to Germany. So the fact that we have so much broken glass here and broken bottles in the waste pit is actually really interesting. So again, multiple possibilities present themselves. They could have been bottles used by the SS and Travniki men, but they could also be, a lot of them, the detritus from the final phases of the camp when there was a less systematic process of extraction of objects. Again, we have lots of domestic items, again, many of the same. I won't kind of relist all of the items, but we had many spoons, knives and forks. But what's interesting to point out is that most of the cutlery was actually bent into all sorts of shapes that you can see here, or the head of the spoon, for example, was completely detached from the body. And it suggests that these had been pushed at, moved around with some force, possibly by machine, to contort them into all of these different shapes, which again perhaps suggests when the camp was being moved around and destroyed. We had quite expensive ceramic ware. We had a portion of a forget-me-not, an acorn motif coin, cup from Italy. We have more Polish pottery, of course, that's rather not surprising, and a number of other identifiable bottles, drinking glasses, paperweights, and the like. We found 9 sets of keys dispersed throughout the assemblage, as well as a number of items connected to personal hygiene and grooming, such as razors, scissors, and combs. And we also had 2 Czech-made toothbrushes with the marking Popular Finish registered Kurinor, along with 3 fragments of shoes and a partial pair of eyeglasses. And so it's possible that a lot of these items did actually belong to the victims of Treblinka, given that many of them came from countries from which victims were known to have been deported. And perhaps some of them were stolen and reused by the SS, perhaps others were damaged, and that's why they ended up in the camp waste pit. And we also had, again, many items that probably belonged to women. So we had a bourgeois perfume bottle from France, a small blue bead, rectangular pink plastic gems, for example. And we know from testimonies that any of the artificial kind of costume jewelry that women wore, often what happened was that, again, there was a special commando that stripped out things like beads and jewels and threw them away, and then it was the metal that was then sent back to Germany for reuse. So that's possibly why some of these items ended up in the waste pit as well. And we found many items were damaged. There were no high-value items amongst this assemblage. All the coins were just Polish grosze, which is the smallest denomination. And we found suitcase fragments. Possibly the suitcases were broken. We don't know why they were thrown away. And we did also find the wheel of a toy car amongst this assemblage, again suggesting the presence of children and through the material culture. One very interesting item we did also come across was this police badge, and it's a hexagonal badge with the number 4 on it, and it actually belonged to a member of the Jewish Order Police. And these were a group of Jewish police responsible for assisting the Nazis with rounding up Jews in the ghettos. And a similar badge to this was actually found by archaeologists at Belzec. And these items indicate the fate of the Jewish Order Police. Once they had fulfilled their usefulness in helping with the roundups, they too were sent to places like Treblinka, where they were murdered. We also found other objects that may be associated with perpetrators, whistles, ventilation grate, reinforced window glass, bullet casings, and barbed wire. Again, more beer bottle tops, broken bottles, including champagne bottles. We also found in this layer, and part of a stein. So again, we have many objects that may well have related to the perpetrators, but undoubtedly mixed in with objects connected to the victims. So I think to draw some conclusions from this work, although the excavations at the old gas chambers and the waste pit were relatively small in scale, I hope in this very much a snapshot of what we discovered at Treblinka, I've been able to show just how much material does actually survive. And I'll never forget the first time that I went to Treblinka and walked the landscape and started to come across objects in a forest and memorial that gives the appearance that everything had been destroyed. My sentiment about this work is always that the Nazis were not successful in hiding the traces of their crimes. It's highly improbable that they ever could be, given the scale of those crimes. Rather, no one actually saw the value in searching for this physical evidence. And that's got a lot to do with the fact that forensic archaeology is a relatively new discipline. And of course, it's taken time to understand the importance and value of objects as sources of understanding for the Holocaust. And I'm very pleased that this is now a burgeoning field of investigation and one that continues to grow. I think these items show us that, yes, of course, items were transferred away from the site. We know that. But also that there were items that were commodified locally. There were items that were treated as waste and thrown away and discarded and were not hidden in those final stages, in particular, of the camp's existence. And there are also many items here that show us about the social lives of the guards, which is always one of the most shocking things to me, is the way that the guards were living, they were working, but they were socializing, they were undertaking leisure activities just meters away from the gas chambers and mass graves. And I think it's extremely important that that narrative is not omitted from studies of the Holocaust, to understand that these were, as Christopher Browning calls them, ordinary men doing extraordinary things. And as a final point, I'd like to just highlight as well that my team and I have also engaged in numerous projects to ensure that information about the archaeological discoveries at Treblinka can be shared with a wide audience. Obviously, presentations such as this, but I've also worked with artists, as I already mentioned, to explore some of the issues that arise with interpretation and the difficulties of interpretation of Holocaust-related objects. Some of the ethical challenges when you're confronted, for example, with different perceptions of objects, particularly different opinions of survivors and victims as to what these objects represent. And also to explore the ways that items can be manipulated and utilised to deny that the crimes took place, or how they can be recommodified because of the looting that goes on at these types of sites. And I think these approaches are really vital to ensure that a broad range of communities and individuals have the opportunities to learn about the Holocaust and its legacies through the physical evidence that these crimes left behind, to give answers to families who've waited decades to know what happened to loved ones, to ensure we ask difficult questions of this difficult part of our collective history, and to ensure that as educators we continue to find new ways to tell the stories of those who cannot speak for themselves. And so it's to those people who suffered at Treblinka and those who suffered because of Treblinka and continue to do so in the present, that I would like to dedicate my lecture this evening. I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention, and thank you to everyone who made this evening possible. And in particular, I would like to thank everybody, particularly the survivors and their families, and the museum at Treblinka, who trusted me, and the Jewish community as well, the Chief Rabbi of Poland, who trusted me with the incredible honor of leading a team to investigate this site. It really has been absolutely life-defining for me, and I do consider it an incredible honor to have been able to recover some of the evidence connected to the people who suffered at Treblinka. So thank you very much again for your attention, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.